I'm Deborah Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of the Buffett Institute, and it is such a pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's event, Anne Applebaum in Conversation with Peter Slevin. We are really grateful to our Northwestern sponsors, the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies, the Department of Political Science, the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures, the Chabraya Center for Historical Studies, the Presidential Fund, and the Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies Research Program. And we're also immensely grateful to the Kyiv-Mohyla Foundation of America, which is sponsoring this event. The president of the foundation, Marta Faryan, will now take the stage to introduce to you Anne Applebaum and Peter Slevin.
Thank you, Deborah. It's been a great pleasure to work with you on this very special program. Since 1991, when the book Between East and West, Across the Borderlands of Europe came out, we've been following our special guest, her work and her career with great admiration. Her appearance on various TV programs, the articles, her much acclaimed books, such as The Red Famine, Iron Curtain, Gulag, Twilight of Democracy, and the current publications became the background for my advocacy work, first as an attorney and then as head of the foundation in the United States to support Ukraine's oldest university, the National University Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, established in 1615. Born in Italy and growing up in Buenos Aires of Ukrainian parents who were refugees after the Second World War, with family stories and lessons of history about the Red Army's brutal takeover of Ukraine, Poland, and Eastern Europe, about the loss of homes, the bomb shelters, and forced migrations, and about the manipulation of information aimed at confusing populations and gaining leverage with the West, even then, during and after Second World War. For years, up to the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, I was used to being told that there was no Ukraine, that I'm not Ukrainian, that I am Russian, when I know perfectly well from my parents, their families, their friends, and history and events, that it was the Soviet Union that gobbled up Ukraine and the other lands and nations it occupied, calling all of them Russians. Even as a teenager in the United States, I could tell when information on TV or in the newspapers was being manipulated, maybe because I grew up in Buenos Aires, where the government controlled all media and nobody believed anything that came out of the newspapers. And disinformation is even more intense now, more effective and more sophisticated with the use of technology, poisoning the information environment in the United States and throughout the world. Anne Applebaum describes and analyzes our times with acute and intimate knowledge and documentation. In 2018, just 6 years ago, I had the honor to be with her in Ukraine when she met with leaders of civil society and even with the then president of Ukraine, President Poroshenko, and he delivered a commencement speech to students and received an honorary doctorate from the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. At that time, she warned about the consequences of Putin's narratives and ambitions and the danger of Russian disinformation that caused chaos in Ukraine, and she emphasized the importance of education in preparing a new generation who understands that for their own good, peace, welfare, and future, freedom and human dignity must be part of the country's political policy. At that time, she noted that the project Stop Fake, born at the Kyiv-Mohyla School of Journalism in 2014, was ahead of the colleagues in the West and warned about the use of false information as a weapon used by Russia and China. Let's not forget that just a few years ago, when challenged about the veracity of information being shared, the spokesperson of the previous administration said, "What's truth anyways?" That is why, at this important time in world affairs, on behalf of the National University Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, the foundation in the United States, we are proud to co-sponsor this event together with Northwestern University. I wish to thank Professor Deborah Cohen and her tremendous team and colleagues, and Professor Johanan Petrowski-Stern for making this event possible. There could be no other person to conduct a conversation with our guest than Professor Peter Slevin. Of the Medill School of Journalism, who spent a decade on the Washington Post and is a contributor to the New Yorker. Professor Slevin teaches classes on politics in the media, the U.S. role in world affairs, and on reporting strategies. With years of working throughout the world, we are fortunate to hear his perspective. It's a pleasure and an honor to introduce our guests, Anne Applebaum and also Professor Peter Slevin.
Thank you, Marta, for that, and thanks everybody for coming. What a crowd! And I can't say I'm surprised when you think about the remarkable work that Anne Applebaum has done throughout her career. We have the extraordinary good fortune to have Anne with us today. She has set a standard for clear-eyed assessments of the danger of authoritarian rule in a world that seems more topsy-turvy every day. Whoever it was, and we know who it was, who said it's the end of history was a little premature, I would say. Her work is extraordinarily wide-ranging. It's deep. Bluster is not in Anne's vocabulary. A little bit of background before we invite Anne to share her wisdom. In 2004, she won a Pulitzer Prize for her book, The Gulag: A History. It was a thoroughly documented history of the Soviet labor camps. And as you probably know, between 1929 and 1953, an estimated 18 million people went through those camps and 4.5 million died. Her next book will come out on July 23rd. Its cheerful title is Autocracy Inc, The Dictators Who Want to Run the World. These dictators and their friends, she argued, are actually not motivated by ideology or religion, and certainly not by a desire to spread goodwill and democracy. Rather, they're driven by their desire for wealth and power. She identifies kleptocracies with a web of connections, not just within individual countries designed to seize and preserve power, but across national boundaries. And they often target the United States, she reports, in campaigns that are designed to weaken our own democracy. She wrote a groundbreaking article just 2 days ago, day before yesterday, that appeared as the cover story in this week's Atlantic, called The New Propaganda War. And she showed that there are willing accomplices to this project in the United States as well. And not only Donald Trump, whose affection and envy for autocrats is very well documented. In her provocative work, Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, published in 2020, she wrote that authoritarianism was on the rise around the world. She pointed out that there are no easy explanations for this, but she made clear that this is not an urge that comes exclusively from an injured underclass, rural and poor, as the stereotypes might have it, nurtured just on grievance. She points to significant thinkers and writers, politicians and political activists, whom she suggests should know better. There's been no severe economic crisis, no pernicious wave of immigration, certainly none of the desperation that defined Europe after the First World War, when fascism rose so dramatically. She offered one disturbing conclusion. She wrote, "Given the right conditions, any society can turn against democracy. Indeed, if history is anything to go by, all of our societies eventually will." And on that cheerful note, let's dig in.
What are you trying to depress me before I?
Well, we're going to have a moment of an upbeat moment in just a couple of minutes. But first, you write about a lot of dark subjects. What gets you up every morning and over to the keyboard?
So what gets me up every morning is people like you.
That's good.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. Thanks in particular to the Kyiv-Mohyla Foundation, for whom I have done a number of events before. Thanks to all the various groups at Northwestern who are represented here. Peter, you and I did an online event for Northwestern.
We did in 2020. Yes, the Leopold lecture, when Twilight of Democracy had just come out.
Right, online. So I didn't quite make it here then because I didn't make it anywhere. But I really appreciate it. But I mean, the serious answer to that question is, a long time ago that nothing is inevitable. So the idea that this country or any country inevitably declines or inevitably succeeds is wrong. And inevitability is very dangerous, because if something is inevitable, then you don't have to do anything about it. And so I always tell myself, what happens tomorrow depends on not some law of history, but it depends on what we do today. So I keep telling myself that, and I tell everybody I know that. That's what keeps me going.
And how do you keep such an even keel? A question that I imagine a few people in this audience might wonder every now and then these days here. How do you keep an even keel with all of this that's going on and all the tumult that you're living in and covering?
I mean, I could ask that question of anybody. I mean, the tumult that we live in, this feeling that we're constantly bombarded by new information and new crises, is the thing that we all share. It's actually the thing that we now all share with, not just in America, but with different countries, and the way in which we now get and process our information, on phones essentially, that feed us up new bits of information every minute or every hour, I think is one of the sources of our current sense of unrest. I mean, I don't think human beings were made for constantly refreshing the news. I mean, it's addictive and distracting. And I think actually one of the reasons why you see now a kind of longing for something more stable, even a longing for autocracy around the world, is that people want some kind of, they want the noise to stop. And I think that's an unfortunate but true.
How worried should we be? Something that's
right. No, I don't know what it is. Is that better?
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's try it and see if that works.
All right.
How worried should we be? I mean, the rise of authoritarianism and Autocracy Inc.
So authoritarianism isn't a single. There are different kinds of conversations to have. There's a conversation to have about the rise of, it's not so much authoritarianism, but illiberalism in the United States. Skepticism for American institutions, skepticism of our voting system, and that's one piece of the problem. And there's a second piece of the problem, which is described in my new book, which is the ways in which international autocrats now increasingly work together. So, and by this I mean quite a wide group of countries. So Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, but also countries you don't think of as much being in that group: Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Belarus. They don't share an ideology, and they don't share even a common description of the world, and they can be very different. And so the Chinese Communist Party and the Iranian theocracy and Russian nationalism and Bolivarian socialism in Venezuela, these are very different kinds of they're theories of politics that have very different national origins. But they have begun to understand the need to work together and to coalesce around around a certain set of ideas, most of which have to do with us. Us meaning we in America, we in this room, we here at Northwestern University. And some of them have been very explicit about it. There's a Chinese document dating from 2013. It has the wonderful name of document number 9.
Excellent.
Very good. Which was published in it wasn't published. It was circulated inside the Chinese leadership in 2013, which described a list of perils facing the Chinese Communist Party. And top of the list was Western constitutional democracy. Also on the list was what we understand as journalism and free speech. And this is because the leaders of those kinds of countries have come to understand that their main political opponents, whether it's the Hong Kong democracy movement, whether it's Navalny's movement in Russia, whether it's Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's presidential campaign in Belarus in 2020, whether it's the multiple democratic movements that have convulsed Venezuela, they've come to understand that their internal enemies, or the people they would describe as their enemies, are using the language of democracy, of rights, of rule of law, of transparency and accountability, and they've also come to understand that it's not enough merely to ban those people or to put them in jail, that those ideas keep recurring, and therefore they need to poison those ideas. And this is what my Atlantic article this week was, which was actually an excerpt from my new book, was a description of how they think about that. So they think about, how do we poison democracy? How do we write about it as chaotic and divisive and degenerate, sexually degenerate, politically degenerate? How do we convince people not to think like that? And so they've coalesced around these ideas. They share ways of transmitting and selling those ideas. They share tactics for promoting propaganda, but that's not the only thing they've come to agree. They also share surveillance tactics and technology. The Chinese were really the leaders in this, but others have adopted some of the same tools. And they also share ways of stealing and hiding money. There are common ways in which the kleptocracy works around the planet. They hide money in using shell companies and anonymity and tax havens in similar ways. Some of this has been periodically, this gets revealed in big pieces of investigative journalism, the Panama Papers, and the papers. Some of it is being fought against. There's been a very, very slowly in the United States, we're beginning to pass laws, that will eventually make it impossible to have anonymous companies. But many of the leaders of the dictatorships have sequestered and hidden their money in similar ways. And that's a part of also their interest in pushing back against transparency and accountability. I mean, I suppose it's not really the punchline is the wrong way to put it. I mean, the important piece of the story is the role that we, meaning we in the democratic world, have played in this process. One of the metaphors that I like to argue against is this idea that we're entering a period of a new Cold War, where, I don't know, there's like some kind of new Berlin Wall, and there's autocracies on one side and democracies on the other, and that it's going to be, one side is going to fight the other, and there's going to be some kind of showdown. I actually think the world is much more complicated than that. There is a group of autocracies who define themselves that way and think a lot about how to undermine us. There's a group of democracies who define themselves that way and sometimes work together. There are a lot of countries in the middle who work sometimes one side of one another. And there are also groups on both sides. So within Venezuela, there's a very important, very interesting democracy movement, which if there were a free election would probably. Within Iran, there was an extraordinary women's protest, which again was enormously popular, and if there were freedom in Iran, would also probably win. So there are inside the autocracies, there are dissidents, and inside the democracies, there are enablers. I mean, there are both in the long time in the business community, but also there's a part of the American political spectrum that also sympathizes with the autocratic narrative, that also wants to portray American democracy as degenerate and divisive and chaotic, has political reasons for doing that. So the picture I would paint is of rather of networks. Mm-hmm. There is an autocratic network, democratic network, and they cross borders, if that makes sense.
One of the things that quite distinguishes your work is how sweeping it is and how you do it in a comparative way. And one of the things that I've always been interested in about your work is your interest in language, in rhetoric, and constructing what is truth and what is not, something that, of course, we're thinking about here. And part of the efforts of these leaders across the world is to construct, I mean, would it be, go too far to say they're constructing slightly alternate realities too, and having an argument about what in fact is truth?
So it's very much in the interest of autocracies to convince people not just that there isn't any truth or to cast doubt on it, but that you can't ever know it. Because from their point of view, once people can name and describe and identify problems, then they become dangerous, because then they can organize around them, they can seek solutions, they can try to fix them. And what they prefer is for people not to be engaged in politics at all. And so, I wrote in the Atlantic piece, which comes from the book, and this is not new at all, actually, it's a very old idea. I wrote again about this famous phrase, the fire hose of falsehoods. So you see a number of, you see it in Putin's Russia, you see it in Syria. You can see examples of dictatorships whose propaganda operates not merely by, telling one lie about reality, or not merely, as in Soviet times, trying to construct a more beautiful image of society than the real one. Remember the Soviet propaganda with, nice, happy ladies driving tractors and lots of steel production and sunny days and so on. I mean, people could see through that because they knew it wasn't true. It contradicted with what they saw on the street. A much more sophisticated and much more dangerous way of doing propaganda is to bombard people with different kinds of contradictory false information all the time. And so famously, the most extraordinary version of this was in 2014, when Russian soldiers shot down the Malaysian airliner that was flying over eastern Ukraine. And I know this because actually I had a colleague at the British Foreign Office who was tracking all the different explanations for why that had happened. And they ranged from, it was the Ukrainian army who did it, it was the CIA who did it, but also that it was some people had put dead bodies onto the plane before it took off and then exploded it over Ukraine in order to embarrass Russia. There was just this enormous series of theories about why it happened that were produced on Russian media, and sometimes produced within an hour of one another, completely contradictory. And of course, the purpose of that was to make people say, we don't know what happened, we have no idea what happened, and we will never know. In other words, to erase even the possibility of finding out what was true. And that is a goal of that form of propaganda. And it's not something that we knew in the 20th century. It didn't work quite in that way. But you see it, you see it used most effectively in Russia, and of course we have politicians who are trying it here now too.
And when you talk about the idea of sharing, basically throwing sand up in the air and hoping that everything is confused. Is it the kind of thing that one person, one leader can do, or does it require many, as you say, enablers? Does it require media? Is it a larger project to make it work?
I mean, the leader is very important.
Mhm.
I mean, the leader is, I just this will sound like a frivolous comparison actually, but I remember I have an Italian friend who claims that Berlusconi, being the leader of Italy for so long, had an effect on the acceptability of big differences in intimate relationships. That it used to be not okay for young women to be involved with older men, and then after many years of Berlusconi being in power, it was okay. I mean, this is an anecdote I'm repeating. This was his explanation. But there is leaders do set an example. People watch them. Again, especially in the United States, where the president is somebody of such respect and has so much power. The way the president behaves, as whether it's morally or politically, inevitably affects others. So I do think leaders are extremely important. I mean, we also, of course, have now as we alluded to this at the beginning, we have a system of news and media and information that also enables this kind of, falsehood telling or this fire hose of falsehoods, much more efficiently than you could have ever had in the past. So, the fact is that our main means of getting news is now set up in such a way that it's very easy for someone to send you a message every 15 minutes, in a way that it wouldn't have been back in the days when everybody only got the news at 6 o'clock on the evening news program, or early first thing in the morning when they got the newspaper. This kind of tactic wouldn't have been so effective because it wasn't possible to be bombarded in the way that people are now bombarded with information. So I think the structure of social media and the internet more broadly has changed the way that we look at the world.
You said something interesting in my Medill class today about the algorithms on Facebook and Twitter and how they seem to downgrade journalism.
And this is recent.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this is not a secret to people in the journalism world. There have been a number of changes on social media just very recently that seem to be deliberately designed to not promote journalism and not promote news. So the Facebook algorithm now, and this is also true of Instagram, although Instagram is less important, but for this purpose, the Facebook algorithm now downgrades news. So if you post a newspaper article, it doesn't have the same spread that it used to have. So Facebook is trying to get out of politics in a sense. Twitter is the same. So those of you who use it may know that it used to be that when you posted something on Twitter, you would see a headline. They took the headlines away. Some of the news organizations have made it, have jiggered around, and sometimes you can just about see a headline. But they took away headlines. They downgrade news. News stories don't spread as fast. And so there's been a deliberate effort to downplay and undermine journalism, and that obviously has an impact on the numbers of people who see journalism and who read it, and the numbers are traceable and this is across the board. I mean, this affects Fox News. It affects, presumably the One American Network. I mean, it affects the right-wing press as well as the left-wing press, as well as the centrist press and everybody in between. So there's been a clear downgrading of news and information that may have consequences in the electoral season.
You've said that you started thinking about some of these issues, particularly misinformation, around 2014, before Donald Trump rode down the golden escalator, and that the rules governing debate seemed to shift, that evidence seemed to matter less, and appeals to raw emotion, particularly in the political world, seemed to take precedence. Was there a moment?
I actually had a personal experience, and one is always, affected more by what affects oneself. And that was that in 2014, following the first invasion of Ukraine, I wrote a lot about Ukraine. I was on TV a lot. I had written I had been working on, rather, it hadn't been published yet. I had been working on a book about Ukrainian history, and I felt some kind of obligation because there aren't that many people who know Ukrainian history. So I spoke and did quite a lot of it. And one of the things that happened in reaction was that a series of articles were written about me that implied that I was somehow taking money for doing this for some nefarious causes. I mean, it doesn't really matter what the details, but there was some details about my income that they got from a source in Poland, and some of it, there's like all these things. There's some things that were true and some things fake. And what interested me was first that this article came out. It was on an otherwise, at that time, it's now just, I don't even know if it still exists, but it was a fairly, it was considered a real Russian news site. It was a news site that published a lot of information about Russian business. I saw it there, and I was like, and it was a very authoritative statement about me that I take money to promote Ukraine. Then I saw it began to appear in other places, and I saw it appeared on Rand Paul's father's website. Then I saw it on another Russian. Then I saw it on something that didn't look Russian, but when I looked at it carefully, it was kind of left-wing website that I realized was probably also a fake website. And that was when I understood that there's this series of websites and organizations that were all echoing and reflecting and repeating the story. So if you were just a normal person who lived in that echo chamber and you saw these things, oh wow, this story about Anne Applebaum must be true because I see it in all these different places. And then there was the sort of height of this was when Julian Assange's WikiLeaks Twitter account tweeted the story to his then 2 million followers. And, I got upset about it, and I talked to a lawyer, can I sue? And they were like, you're going to, no, you can sue a journalist in Moscow and then nothing will happen. But that was my first understanding that, first of all, such systems exist, that thing, this is deliberate. This is a deliberate package. And then I also understood that I can't do anything about it. I actually have no recourse. If I repeat the story and deny it, that just spreads it farther. There's no, and this is an understanding that I had, and my husband, who's in politics, had it also at about the same time. Others I know had, that we've suddenly entered a world in which you can't do anything about fake stories about yourself, and you simply have to learn to live with it. And that was essentially what lawyers told me at the time.
Pretty sobering.
It's now actually the systems now, again, this is in my article and in my book, but the systems now are much more sophisticated than that. So now there's ways in which, for example, videos are uploaded to the internet. They're then passed around to a group of both real and fake people. Then the original video disappears or the account disappears so that the origins can't be traced. The system of doing this, essentially the same process, has now become, much more sophisticated and so on. And the only way in which you could seriously thinking about stopping it was you would have to think about changing the regulation of social media, which we are, as a society, are not ready to do yet. But this sea change happened, and it wasn't just social media, it was also, as I say, the nature of the internet, and it changed, I think, politics from that moment on forever. I think it begins around 2011, 2012.
I want to turn to Russia and Vladimir Putin, but first, how do you as an individual deal with that, knowing the flack you may get or will likely get?
So when the first time it happened, and anybody in public life now knows, for any university president, people who run companies. I mean, it's not about me at all. It's just my introduction to it. The only solution you have is to develop a kind of tough skin, like I don't care. And after a while, you just don't care. Then you move on.
Presumably that applies to journalists who are called enemies of the people, fake news,
politicians. But as I said, many ordinary people. Not that journalists aren't ordinary people, but try being think about what university presidents now deal with. sometimes it's their own fault, but sometimes it's not.
Understood.
Think about what what celebrities deal with. I mean, it's now just a part of being in the public sphere.
Right. Well, let's talk about Russia and what Vladimir Putin was up to in 2014 when you started especially thinking about disinformation, and of course the story he is telling now about what this is all about, commanding Russian media in the way that he is. Polls seem to indicate, to the extent that they're even useful, that an awful lot of Russians buy his story. What's he up to?
For that, actually.
Yeah. Tell us more, because the polls just can't be relied upon, presumably. And there's also Signal, Telegram.
There is no such thing as a public sphere in Russia. There is no conversation. People don't participate in a public discussion. There did used to be. It's not that it's un-Russian to do that. I mean, on the contrary. But there is everybody knows what's legal and illegal to speak about. It is illegal to criticize the war in Ukraine. So the fact that people don't criticize the war in Ukraine doesn't reflect a belief. It reflects the fact that it's illegal. And so, once the rules of public debate are set like that, then people don't participate in it because it's dangerous. And they have, even people who are brave might have, a mother-in-law in the hospital, or they might have kids they have to worry about. I mean, not everybody can defy the law or make big public statements and pay the consequences. Not everybody has that freedom or that ability. I mean, and so there isn't a public sphere, there isn't a public debate. And so there isn't anything to measure. We don't know what people really think. And there's also a way in which it doesn't matter, because there's also no mechanism whereby public opinion plays a role in politics. So Putin doesn't have to worry about public opinion in the way that President Biden has to worry about it. It's not a part of what he has to think of, what he thinks about when he wakes up in the morning.
And so 10 years after the invasion of Crimea and seizing these parts of Eastern Ukraine, 2 years after the war started, what's he after? What's he up to? What does he want?
So it's almost an odd thing about this, where Putin has said very clearly for a number of years what he wants. I mean, there's not a secret. He's never lied about it. He's been very crystal clear. And what he wants is a change in the rules of at least how Europe works. So the package of laws and habits and institutions that were created in Europe after the Second World War, and that were then reinforced at different moments, when the Helsinki Treaty, and then later after 1989, in which the nations agree not to change borders by force, and in which human rights and at least as a base point, as an ambition, are fundamental in relationships between nations. And that, I mean, if you look at the language of the UN Charter or the OSCE, or even other ones, the Organization of American States and others, you always find this language. You find this language about human dignity, about rights, about, each one document has a little different emphasis, but freedom of speech, freedom to associate. He wants to end that system. He doesn't want that language to mean anything anymore. He wants to, it's always been problematic. I mean, a lot of these ideals have been aspirational rather than factual. But he wants to show that they don't matter, and we don't. He doesn't care, and he originally thought that we didn't care, that he thought we wouldn't fight in Ukraine, we wouldn't push back against him. And he wants to show he can change borders by force. He can build concentration camps in Ukraine. So all this other language, never again, we won't see this happening in our lifetime, but that he wanted to show that that's not true. He wanted to show that you can kidnap Ukrainian children and take them to Russia with impunity, and nobody can stop. And so on and so on. So that his goal was to show that none of that matters, and that it can be safely ignored. And
to what extent is he succeeding? Do you see 2 years on?
So there were a series of. I think in a way this story began in Syria. Syria was one of the first wars in which humanitarian aid convoys and hospitals and medical institutions became targets. I mean, actual targets of the fighting are in a way that was very obvious, and that broke a lot of rules, and we see some of the effect of that in Gaza and elsewhere as well. So it's not him alone, but I do think he has. If he wins in Ukraine, and we can talk about what that looks like, it could be different things. Then I think, yes, he will have established the precedent that you can do anything with impunity. Nobody can stop.
And how would you define Putin winning in Ukraine?
I think he wins if, well, first of all, his goal, by the way, his goal remains the same now as it was at the beginning of the war, which is the destruction of all of Ukraine. So all the people who hope that there can be a partition, or there can be a ceasefire, or we can freeze the line of conflict, and the multiple essays written at the Council on Foreign Relations or elsewhere are making this point, say over and over again. I've been some people saying the same thing since the beginning of the war, are all very nice, but as long as that remains his goal, and by that he means the occupation of Kiev, the placement of a government of Ukraine that is dictated by Russia, maybe with some kind of, I don't know, there are different visions. Maybe there's a rump Ukraine in the West or something, but certainly the takeover and elimination of Ukraine as a nation, I think that's his goal. And until he has given up that goal, there isn't that much we can talk to him about. There isn't some partition that would satisfy him. This isn't really a war for land. He doesn't need this territory. He's got plenty of territory. In fact, a lot of it's empty. There's a lot of space up in Siberia.
And when you say that until he gives up that idea, do you think he can be defeated? Do you think Ukraine can win?
He can be defeated. I think there was even a moment at the end of 2022 when he was even closer to being defeated than we, and that was unfortunately a moment that we missed when we didn't help the Ukrainians move forward quickly. But he needs to be, and it doesn't have to be a military defeat. He simply needs to conclude, as the leaders of so many colonial wars have been concluded in the past, that the effort is no longer worth it. I mean, look at, why did the French leave Algeria? Why did the British leave Ireland, or India? The moment when the occupation of a separate territory becomes too costly for the metropolis, for the colonial power, that's the moment when the war will end, and we will know when that happens. We will see it.
And if Ukraine were to fall to Russia, do you believe he would stop there?
So look at what he's done elsewhere. If you look at the first war that Putin fought, and this is the war that brought him to power, was the war in Chechnya. What happened in Chechnya after the Second Chechen War? So you had an occupation of what had been. I mean, it wasn't an independent territory. It was a part of Russia, but it had its own version of self-rule. It had its own culture and so on. I mean, it was occupied. It became a kind of mini totalitarian state within Russia. And you also had a process of Chechen soldiers becoming, integrated into the Russian army, and we've seen them fighting in Ukraine. So, in other words, in occupied territories, and also the same thing happened in occupied eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk, in Luhansk. The young men from those regions have been drafted into the war. They've become part of the Russian war machine, ahead of as have the impoverished Russians. But the occupied territories become the source of manpower and money, and the stolen companies help as well to propel the war machine forward. So that's what he's done in the past. And I have to assume that any territory he occupies in Ukraine will also be converted into a kind of militarized zone where all young people are drafted, where all companies become part of the war effort. And that I'm just telling you what's happened in other occupied regions, and I'm assuming that would be the case.
Pivoting a little bit to this country and this country's reaction to what's gone on in Ukraine. and of course, some of the implications. You wrote a piece for The Atlantic about what a second term would mean to NATO. And your opening words in that story were from Donald Trump, "I don't give a shit about NATO." And we know that, he had to be pressed to say he would support Article 5. We know that he never understood the funding formula. He disdains it. And you say that in the second term, Trump would be, quote, surrounded by people who either share his dislike of American security alliances or don't know anything about them and don't care. I am wondering if you were surprised when so many Republicans abandoned Ukraine, thinking about those potential implications beyond just Donald Trump.
I mean, I suppose in the larger scheme of things, yes, I'm surprised. The party that described itself for so many years as the party of American security, and whose leaders going back many decades, congressional leaders as well as presidents, were very dedicated to security in Europe, as well as our relationships with allies in Asia and elsewhere. I mean, you think about the role that George Bush Sr. played after 1991 in writing a series of treaties and carrying out a series of negotiations that really meant that the Soviet Union came to an end and broke up relatively peacefully. There were exceptions, but there, could have been, many people had believed it would be worse. And the dedication they made to doing that, the role of diplomats in that era was so important. And when you think of the sophistication and thought that went into that effort, and you compare it to today, it's really a remarkable change. I mean, I suppose I should say that, having followed what's been going on for the last 3 or 4 years, I wasn't that surprised. But yes, if you step back and look at a longer historical period, it's very surprising. I was asked this afternoon, I spoke to the colleagues from the Kyiv-Mohyla Foundation, and we were talking about why and how this happened. And there are a number of explanations. Some are to do with the kinds of Russian propaganda I've been talking about. Some of them are to do with Trump's own example. He is a transactional politician who doesn't feel the tie of alliances and friendships, and doesn't feel that he's part of a shared community of values, not interested in all those treaties that I was talking about signed after the Second World War. And he, and he's the leader, as I was saying, he's the leader of the party. He's our version of Berlusconi. So people follow him and follow his example. So that's also part of it.
Well, one thing you said in the piece about what Trump would mean to NATO and the alliances is the repercussions would extend well beyond Europe, but that it will take a while to notice because Americans, you said, will be, quote, so consumed by the drama of their failing institutions. So,
but yeah.
So I want to turn to questions in a few minutes, but first want to talk about one theme that seems to be unifying your writing and what you've been talking about, and that is the weakening of institutions around the world. You mentioned the potential loss of the rules-based international order, and of course we're seeing it in this country where the administrative state is up for grabs, and deep state, and all these things that Donald Trump talks about. To what extent do you see a danger in Donald Trump at home in November and what he would do in a second term?
I mean, all I can go on is what he says. I don't have a crystal ball, and I can't predict what he'll do. But he does use this language. He talks about being a dictator on day one. He and others around him have pretty explicitly said they won't recognize the results of the election unless they win. So, I have to assume that even if Joe Biden wins, might have a crisis, because there will immediately be another version of January 6th, or at least there will be people who want that to unfold. So he and people around him and think tanks, who support him, have talked about replacing the civil service, so that we don't instead of having experts, or people who've been promoted over many years in the civil service, instead of that, we would have loyalists. We would have people who are specifically loyal to Trump rather than being loyal to the Constitution or to the United States or and so on. He's made comments that indicate he has the same vision for the military. So our military, I have a close family member in the military, and when you take an oath, when you're commissioned, you don't talk about loyalty to the president of the United States. You talk about loyalty to the Constitution, to whoever is the president. If you were to change that and the military were to be loyal personally to the president, then we would have a different kind of military. I don't know how competent Trump is at enacting these kinds of changes, whether it's realistic to think he would be able to do it. You could imagine that if he began, there would be an enormous pushback, and the institutions would fight back, and I can that's what happened last time when he wasn't during his first presidency. He wasn't as he didn't understand the mechanisms of government well enough to have these kinds of plans, and I don't think the people around him did either. I think a second term would be
right.
different.
Project 2025, as
That's right.
some of you all have seen.
So I can say is I don't want to scaremonger. All I'm doing, but if you look at what he says, it is very disturbing.
I wonder what insight you can offer us in looking, since you've looked at so many of these, the history, current events in so many of these countries, about life after Trump and Trumpism, enduring power, if it has some. Do you have, again, you don't have a crystal ball, but if you were to try to project, 10 years from now, a few years from now, are there things that we can say?
Political moves rise and fall. I mean, we were talking before this about the Polish elections. So in Poland, we had, I lived, for those of you who don't know, I lived part of the time.
And this is the upbeat part coming, you guys.
Okay,
it's going to be good.
So I lived part of the time there, and my husband is a Polish politician. And we had, for the last 8 years, it's hard to describe it as Trumpist because it's a different style and it's a different aesthetic and so on. But it was I'd say an autocratic populist party that was very much seeking to capture the institutions of the state in the way that I've just described, and to make the independent part, or sort of the neutral parts of the state party, loyal to their political party. And so much so that during we had an election in October, and they were able to monopolize state media. Public media is very important in Poland. It's the largest. It reaches, many people don't have any other television except for state television. It's free. And they were able to they created this huge network of foundations, for example, who were effectively funding their campaign. They funded quite a lot of other media. In fact, now we know they were funding a lot of so-called independent media, which was not that independent, in fact. And so they had an enormous campaign fund and enormous amount of money, and every conceivable trick you can think of in terms of who's allowed to vote, and people abroad making it very difficult for people outside the country to vote, and so on, was used. And actually, one of the things that happened, they were so convinced they would win that the one thing they did not plan to do was actually steal the election. So they couldn't. They didn't have that set up, and they lost. And when they lost, they were very surprised.
As was the opposition.
As was the opposition. Well,
Right.
some people were. Some people weren't. I was surprised. Not everybody was surprised. And it was proof that even in a media and political landscape where one party is totally dominant, that you can still run an election campaign and win. I mean, it's funny. Poland wasn't yet Venezuela, so we're not yet the rot hadn't progressed that far. Poland has, because of its membership of the European Union, there were constraints on what the ruling party was able to do. So there are reasons why it was still possible, but it was also turned out that if you run a genuinely grassroots campaign, if you campaign all over the country, including in parts of the country where people don't vote for you, if you mobilize people around issues that they care about, and actually abortion played a very big role in that election as well. I can explain the details if you want, but there are ways in which you can overcome that kind of political dominance. So it can be done.
And the turnout was extraordinary, right? In the cities.
And most of the polling was wrong. Was that the turnout was so high? It was higher than in any previous election, including the election in 1989, which ended communism. So it was 74%. In cities, it was 85%. And I have a friend who lives in a neighborhood in Warsaw where it was 92%.
Wow.
So people really were motivated to vote. And so the kind of get out the vote campaigns made a huge difference.
So if you can avoid elections, the election being stolen, there's hope for us. Hope for us all.
I'm not, you know, I mean, I'm not worried about the US election being stolen. I am worried about apathy. And remember that autocratic messaging and autocratic propaganda is designed, you know, to create apathy and to make people not want to vote.
So what questions do we have from you all? With their microphones around.
Good evening. My name is Danilo Lyszczyshin. I'm a first-year history PhD student with Yohanan Petrovsky Shter. You talked about your predictions for what would happen if Putin might win. I'm interested in hearing your predictions as to what might happen if Ukraine will win. You know, not just in the Ukrainian or European context, but abroad with this Autocracy Inc.
I've written about, and my source of information for the significance of Ukraine in the broader world is leaders of opposition to convention, Russia, Iran, Venezuela. I had a remarkable meeting with some of the Venezuelan, so the old Venezuelan embassy in Washington is, for complicated reasons, is now run by the and they were one of the first embassies. But if there's a Venezuelan and a Ukrainian on the embassy that went up immediately after. So those groups of people, those movements, very much understand the Ukrainian war as their. They understand that pushing back against Putin and against Russia is a successful defeat of Putin, or even, you know, as I said, defeat just means they go home. We don't have to would be an advance for them. It would show that these kinds of autocrats don't have impunity. They don't always win. That the democratic world can stand up to them and can be victorious. And so I think it would have enormous effects, you know, around the planet in ways that we can't predict. Just like we followed communism in 1989, also knock-on effects. Because part of the reason why apartheid fails, even though South Africa is far away and it's not part of the same political system. It had that kind of effect. I think a loss for Putin would certainly affect Russia's direct allies, Belarus, immediately. But in Venezuela, most people don't know that Russia does. Maybe even. So it's and it would start. I should, of course, certainly it would be at least it would have had any Chinese leader who was thinking about invading Taiwan would at least capture it twice. So yes, I think it would be an enormous. It would have an enormous. It would be very important. Now this, and I wrote this in. I can't hear. Microphone this up.
Okay, let me preface the question with an observation. Western governments have also had a history of activity
in the information space during the Cold War to promote democracy and also undermine communist governments. These capabilities still exist. In your studies of disinformation now, do you perceive any restraint by Western governments, particularly the United States, in pushing back with their own influence campaigns in Russia and China? It seems we can fight fire with fire, but are holding back.
The tactics of the Cold War era don't work anymore. So, I mean, some of those institutions that were built at that time still exist. So Radio Free Europe still exists. There's now Radio Free Asia. There's sort of US funded media sources in the world. They don't have the same influence and range that they once did. And we don't have the, we don't have the, what's the right word? Maybe we have the desire to do it, but we don't do it. We don't have the habit of doing the kind of information laundering and kind of production of bots and the creation of online echo chambers that the autocrats are willing to do. We don't have Russian. I mean, funny enough, we have Russian-style influence campaigns in the United States run by Americans. We've got plenty of that, you know. But the U.S. government doesn't do that abroad. We don't do the production of lies or the, and so on. And I'm sure there are some people who want to do it, but so far there is no, the hope until now has always been that we're not going to go down that road. We're not going to. So you're right. We don't do it.
Is that moment coming someday, do you think?
Hard for me to imagine how it does, it would work, but we don't really do covert anything very well. So it's hard for me to imagine us doing a covert information campaign that was based on, bot networks. I just don't see it. The people who are best equipped to think about, campaigning in the autocratic states are the citizens of those states and the leaders of those movements. So the best, really by far, I know that, not everyone likes him, but really by far the most effective he's not just an information campaigner, but the most effective opponent of Putin by far was Alexei Navalny. And he was effective in a specific way. He did something that was pretty unique. So he produced these very high quality, almost kind of Hollywood level quality documentaries. And they were documentaries about Russian corruption. And there were several that were very famous. The last one he did was maybe the most famous, and it was about a palace that Putin has built on the Black Sea. And the story was that they had all kinds of stuff. They had drones flying over it, and they had architectural pictures of it, and they had evidence of what kind of furniture was in it. And so they put together this huge documentary. And they produced that. And then the story of the documentary was told by Navalny himself, who was had the quality of looking and sounding like an everyman. He didn't come off as some kind of Moscow elitist. He talked like an ordinary Russian. And so it was both. What he did was he kind of combined investigative journalism, which can be boring, right? So the investigation of kleptocracy in particular, it's very hard to make it appealing and exciting. So he combined investigative journalism with this form of, visual communication. And that film, I haven't looked recently, but it has hundreds of millions of hits. It's like, it was at, 150 million, maybe it's higher than that now. And he managed to reach enormous numbers of people. And so I can't think of anything the U.S. government could do that would be better than that. And it had the merit of being authentically Russian because it was authentically Russian. It wasn't some foreigners telling you something. It was a grassroots, if you will, campaign. And so ultimately, I think it's those groups who are going to those kinds of people who are going to understand best the information environment in their countries. And helping them is the best. I don't know who's in charge, so.
The man with the microphone.
Man with microphone.
Well, my name is Brian Marks, and I have sort of a long-term question. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that the war you refer to in Syria was actually rooted in long-term Eastern Mediterranean drought resulting from climate change. Now, if you look at the world, and I agree with this, as basically a distinction between authoritarian instinct and non-authoritarian instinct.
I just think it's that black and white, but anyway.
In broad strokes. Do you have any sense as to where the climate situations that are coming is going to make shifts in either countries or power centers that will be in response to this catastrophe that we're heading towards?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I would imagine that plays differently in different places. I can't give you an overarching theory of how climate, other than to say that the climate change will exacerbate crises in a lot of places. I mean, there's a connection even in Ukraine. So food prices went up after the invasion of Ukraine. Which will have had knock-on effects, in other countries. And so, and the Russians knew that. And they then, used the fact of, food production issues caused by drought plus food prices going up caused by the war in Ukraine. They knew that was going to create more crises in Western Africa, which is where they have a lot of interest now and they have a lot of business. So they're aware that climate can exacerbate the sense of crisis in particular places, and they're willing to use it. I don't know if that's a full answer. I mean, it doesn't give you an answer for the entire planet, but yeah, I can imagine climate change playing into the number of different wars. Don't forget there are people in the front. They're looking at me, pleadingly, and I'm not in charge.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. My name is Ani. I'm a senior here at Northwestern. And you mentioned at the beginning of this talk how there are many autocrats who are not so much motivated by ideology, but wealth and power. And I'm wondering then what you make of Putin's consistent reliance on rhetoric surrounding traditional Christian values and his adamant rejection of LGBTQ activism in the West, because to me that feels ideological, but perhaps it is merely a means to a different end.
So when I said, I didn't mean they all have ideologies. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party has a very clear ideology. I just meant they don't have a common ideology. There isn't one thing that China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Burma, Zimbabwe, and Azerbaijan share. So they don't have a shared ideology. So when we think about the Cold War, when we think about the 20th century, there was a shared ideology that the communist world had, or they had language in common, and they don't have that. Of course, they all have their own ideologies. I mean, in the case of that kind of traditional values ideology, or the use of that kind of language, I mean, my general view is that's a how do I explain it? I mean, it's a way of creating almost a distraction. So if you look at actually how people live life in Russia, so the Russians in occupied Ukraine, there has been an enormous amount of repression of Christians, Protestants, Ukrainian Orthodox, Catholics. There've always been, and so there have been a systematic program of repression of Christians. But also in Russia itself, there's a repression of especially Protestant sects of different kinds, and this actually goes back to the Stalin era. I mean, when I wrote a book about the Gulag, and you run across imprisoned religious people in the camps at that time. Is Russia you know, are Russians particularly church going? They're not. They don't go to church much. Do they read the Bible? Not much. You know, is abortion legal? It is. I mean, so you know, even is Russia a Christian country? Well, it actually has a very large percentage of Muslims. A number is actually disputed. It could be 10%. It could be 12%. In fact, it's a multi-ethnic and multiracial country. You know, it's not a white Christian country, as right-wing propaganda would have it. So the creation of this idea of traditional culture and so on is part of is a tool to hide what Putinism really is, what it has been from the beginning, which is a system of internal theft and corruption. And I think there are a number of other liberal leaders and autocrats who use it in the same way. So I think that's how Viktor Orban uses the same set of ideas. It was I wrote about this a few months ago. You know, Orban occasionally, he or in one case it was Tucker Carlson who was in Budapest saying it for him, often talks about, you know, there was another recent Hungarian official said that, you know, our conflict with the United States is because Americans don't like the fact that we're a Christian country. This couldn't be farther from the truth. There is a conflict with the United States, and it's about the you know, Hungary's continued you know, corrupt links to Russia as well as China. And that's a big problem for America, given that Hungary is a member of NATO and Hungary's in the European Union and so on. So they put up there's almost like a veil of culture war. They've learned that the culture war works very well. It helps them create international coalitions. It helps consolidate, you know, friends. It gives them a way of speaking to people, you know, they don't like us on the outside because they don't like our traditional Hungarian culture. But I don't think it represents reality.
Thank you for coming. It's been incredibly interesting. My question is regarding Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Wagner Group. It's sort of like a two-sided question. One is on Wagner operations in the Sahel, on what sort of thing do we expect to happen there with the rise of authoritarian governments in the Sahel region in Africa, and then is with Wagner's operations in Ukraine, who sort of filled the power vacuum that Prigozhin's death left.
As I understand it, and I haven't looked at it or followed it very closely in recent weeks. As I understand it, there was a kind of power struggle over who gets the Wagner operations. And you're right, there are some, so those of you know, so Wagner is a mercenary group that was essentially helping dictatorships in West Africa, mostly in West Africa and Central Africa. And they did so through supplying mercenaries and thugs, but also through they had a kind of business side of the operation as well. So whatever it was, diamond mines or gold mines and so on. And there's been some transfer to other members of the Russian military or other paramilitary leaders who've slowly taken over. In Ukraine, as I understand it, they were replaced mostly by Chechens, and as well as there was an enormous recruiting drive in the poorer parts of Russia. You know, there are a lot of regions of Russia where the relatively high salaries that are offered for soldiers was enough to recruit people to fight. So that was I mean, I don't think there's an equivalent of the Wagner prisoner operation that we saw in, you know, the big first part of the war. But so far they're finding some manpower to replace it. There, you got it. See, you were looking at me. I was like,
my name is Margaret Jankowski, and right now I happen to be reading your Red Sermon, and a lot of what was happening in the 1930s is exactly what I see as happening in Eastern Europe, especially in Ukraine right now, with regard to the type of propaganda and the whole propaganda apparatus that Russia is spreading. As someone who was born and grew up in northeastern Poland, about 20 miles west of the Soviet Union. I have a very acute awareness of what living under that apparatus is like. In that context, given that Putin is suffering from an incurable disease called old age, and the hope is that he will come to an end. Do you think that Putinism without Putin is likely to continue, or is he a phenomenon that the people around him are looking to get rid of?
So one of the notable aspects of Russian politics now is that not only do we not know who would replace Putin, we don't know how that person would be chosen. So there is no Politburo. There is no Soviet Communist Party. There isn't some kind of council of elders who would have the legitimacy to choose the next president of Russia. So the only thing that we know is that however he eventually dies, whether he's falls down the stairs or, you know, is hit by a bus or falls out a window. I mean, you know, Novichok poisoning, I don't know, whatever. Whatever happens, there will immediately be a power vacuum and a leadership crisis. I mean, I'm sure there's someone who will immediately take power, and then I can well imagine that that person would immediately have a lot of enemies. So all I can say to you is that there will be a, you know, a massive, complicated moment when that happens. And no doubt there will be some people who want to continue the current system if it's good for them personally. And no doubt there are many people who don't like it. I mean, we know that there's a part of the Russian elite that even if they're still in Moscow and even if they don't say anything, doesn't like the war. I mean, that's not a secret. You know, periodically they emerge from the murk to say it. Sometimes they say it off the record. Sometimes they say it to government officials and so on. So we know they're there. And there were a lot of people who liked the idea that Russia was connected to Europe and they could travel easily in Europe and so on, and who don't like the current system. But who will win that unpredictable contest? I can't tell you.
I wish we could keep going, but I think we better wrap it up. I want to ask Anne one final question of you as an historian who's written several books about history. When you look at this remarkable sweep and this incredible command you have of all these countries and all these issues, and of course, what seems like a deepening descent into darkness if it doesn't go well. I hope it's not going to be quite that bad. Any sense of how historians will look back on this period globally?
I think we're in a turning point period, and it will be remembered that way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the way that the period around 1989, 1991 was a turning point. I mean,
See, you got good news in the end, just as you'd hoped.
Sorry?
Got good news in the end. We're at a turning point. I'm sorry, I'm just.
I mean, I just don't know which way it's turning. Yeah. I think
Yeah.
you know, I think that this, you know, the decisions made, but as I said, I mean, we all have the ability to influence that. I mean, I can't tell you what's going to happen because what happens depends on what people do. And I repeat what I said at the beginning. I don't think anything is inevitable. Inevitability is a kind of cop-out. You know, there's no inevitable decline and there is no inevitable rise. You know, there is, you know, I don't believe in the arc of history, even though that's such a great metaphor. I think that we affected, you know, you know, there are a lot of things that will happen by chance or unexpectedly, or there are events that can't be predicted as well. So I mean, always remember that, you know, things can change in ways you don't expect.
Inevitability is a kind of cop-out, words to live by. It's in your hands. Anyway, thanks a million, Anne, for this. This is
So
great.
much.